The air in Dust Devil Springs was thick enough to chew. It was the kind of heat that baked the promises right out of a man, leaving nothing but grit and thirst. On days like this, the town felt less like a home and more like a punishment. And today was Founders Day, the one day of the year the whole county pretended to celebrate the dust and the struggle. The centerpiece of that celebration was Silas Croft's auction, and everyone knew what that meant. He stood on the crude wooden stage in the center of the square, a snake in a waistcoat. His voice, slick with false charm, echoed off the saloon front. A fine day for new beginnings, he boomed, but his eyes held no warmth. They were chips of slate, scanning the crowd for coin and weakness. From the back, leaning against a support post for the general store's awning, Jedediah Kane watched. Kane was a man carved from the land itself, all harsh lines and quiet strength. He owned the Black Creek Ranch, a spread so vast it was its own small kingdom. He never came to town unless he had to, and he never spoke unless it was necessary. Today, for some reason, he was here, his shadow long and still in the afternoon sun. He watched Croft preen and posture, and his face gave away nothing. Not a flicker of interest, not a hint of disgust. He was just there. The auction started with the usual fare. A few head of stubborn cattle, a broken-down wagon, the labor contracts of men who'd gambled away their futures. The crowd murmured and bid, the sound a low, desperate hum. Then Croft clapped his hands together, his smile turning sharp and cruel. "And now," he announced, "for a very special lot, a piece of fine porcelain from the East, slightly damaged in transit." Two of his hired thugs dragged a woman onto the stage. She stumbled, her dress torn at the shoulder, her hair a tangled mess. But it was her face that made the whole town go silent. One eye was swollen shut, a nasty purple bruise spreading across her cheekbone like a storm cloud. Her lip was split. She looked fragile enough to shatter, but her good eye burned with a fire that hadn't been put out yet. She stared at the dirt floor of the stage, refusing to look at the leering faces in the crowd. "This is Lila," Croft said, his voice dripping with mock pity. "Came all the way out here to be a respectable wife. Signed a contract and everything." He held up a piece of paper, waving it like a flag of victory. "Unfortunately, she had a change of heart. Decided my hospitality wasn't to her liking. Broke the contract." He paused, letting the implication hang in the dead air. He was the one she was supposed to marry. He was the one who trapped her. "So now," Croft continued, his voice hardening, "she has a debt to pay. The cost of her passage. The cost of my inconvenience." He reached out and tilted her chin up with one finger, forcing her to look at the crowd. He pointed to the bruise. "A bit of a fall, you see. Clumsy girl." Then he laughed. It was a high, ugly sound that cut through the silence. He laughed at her pain, at her humiliation, at the broken promise of a better life. And from the back of the crowd, Jedediah Kane said nothing. He just watched, his face a mask of stone. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. It was as if he were part of the landscape, an unmovable feature of the dusty earth. But his eyes were fixed on the auctioneer. The bidding began with a jeer from the crowd. "I'll give you $5 for the damaged goods, Croft," a grimy miner shouted, and a few others laughed along with him. Silas Croft's smile tightened. He wanted her humiliated, but he also wanted his money. $5? For a woman who can cook and clean? Don't be foolish, gentlemen. The bidding starts at 20. 20! Someone else called out, a ranch hand with more loneliness than sense. Lila flinched. Every bid was a new nail in her coffin. She kept her gaze down, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, the knuckles white. She was trying to disappear, to become so small that the world would forget she existed. 30! Shouted the grimy miner, a man they called Grimy Pete for a reason. His grin revealed a graveyard of brown teeth. The bids crawled upward, 35, 40. Each one a fresh wave of shame washing over her. The men bidding weren't looking for a wife or a helper. They were looking for property, something to own, something to break. Croft egged them on, his voice a venomous whisper, describing her potential duties with a wink and a nudge. Jedediah Kane remained perfectly still. He hadn't shifted his weight, hadn't blinked. It was unsettling. Most folks would have at least shown some pity, some anger, or even some grim satisfaction. Kane showed nothing. It was like watching a hawk on a wire waiting, but waiting for what? He had no wife, no need for a housekeeper he couldn't hire honestly. He had no business here. The bidding stalled at $50 with Grimy Pete in the lead. He puffed out his chest, already looking at Lila like she was his. $50, Croft called out, scanning the crowd. A bargain for a lifetime of service. Going once. Lila's head bowed lower. A tear finally escaped her good eye, tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. Going twice. Croft raised his wooden gavel. His eyes met Kane's for a split second, a flicker of challenge in their depths. Kane's expression did not change. Sold. $1,000. The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the oppressive heat like a shard of ice. Every head in the square turned. The words had come from the back, from the shadow of the general store's awning. Jedediah Kane had spoken. A collective gasp went through the crowd. $1,000. That was more than most men in Dust Devil Springs saw in 5 years. It was enough to buy a small herd of prime cattle, a plot of land. It was a nonsensical sum for a woman with a bruised face and a broken contract. It was an impossible price. Silas Croft's jaw dropped. The smug smirk vanished, replaced by pure, slack-jawed shock. He stared at Kane, his eyes wide. What? What did you say? Kane didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. He just pushed himself off the post and started walking forward. He moved with a slow, deliberate purpose that made the crowd part for him like the Red Sea. He walked right up to the stage, his gaze locked on Croft, ignoring Lila completely. $1,000, Croft stammered, his mind catching up, greed quickly overwhelming his surprise. He saw the heavy coin purse at Kane's belt. I have a bid of $1,000. Do I hear 1,100? Anyone? He looked around desperately, but no one dared speak. Grimy Pete had shrunk back into the crowd, his face pale. No one was going to bid against Jedediah Kane. Not now. The silence was absolute, broken only by the buzzing of flies. Kane's stare was a physical weight on Croft, pinning him to the stage. It was no longer an auction. It was a confrontation. Going once, Croft said, his voice trembling slightly. Going twice. He looked at Kane, whose expression was a promise of something cold and final. Sold, Croft whispered, a bead of sweat tracing a line down his temple. To Mr. Kane. Kane didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped onto the stage, unhooked the heavy leather pouch from his belt, and tossed it at Croft's feet. It landed with a solid, definitive thud, the sound of finality. He still hadn't looked at Lila. He just jerked his head toward the edge of the stage. A silent order. Come on. Then he turned his back on them all and walked away, not even checking to see if she followed. Lila stood frozen for a moment. She looked from the sack of gold at Croft's feet to the broad, retreating back of Jedediah Kane. She didn't know which one terrified her more. The man who had beaten her, or the man who had just bought her for the price of a kingdom. Her body ached, her spirit was bruised raw, but she knew one thing for certain. Staying here was a death sentence. Taking a shaky breath, she stepped off the stage and followed the silent rancher, leaving the whispers and the stares of Dust Devil Springs behind her. The journey to Black Creek was made in silence, a deep, unnerving silence that stretched as wide as the plains around them. Kane had untied a spare horse from the hitching post, a sturdy mare, and motioned for her to mount. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a word. He just swung himself into his own saddle and set off at a steady pace, heading north into the vast, empty country he called home. Lila followed a few paces behind, her mind racing. Who was this man? Why had he done this? The questions echoed in her head, but she didn't dare ask them. There was an aura around Kane, a wall of quiet intensity that discouraged conversation. He rode with an easy confidence, a man completely at home in the harsh landscape. He was a part of it, the jagged rocks, the resilient scrub, the endless, unforgiving sky. She stole glances at him. His profile was sharp, his jaw set. He never looked back to check on her, but she had the feeling he knew exactly where she was, down to the inch. He was aware of everything. The circling hawk overhead, the rustle of a lizard in the brush, the unsteady rhythm of her horse's gait. Was this a rescue, or had she just traded one cage for another? The $1,000 price tag felt like a brand on her soul. It declared her his property, just as surely as Croft's sham contract had. She braced herself for what might come next, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. After what felt like an eternity, the terrain began to change. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, and a line of dark green cottonwoods appeared in the distance, marking the path of a creek. Black Creek. Soon a sprawling ranch house came into view, nestled in a valley. It was a fortress of a house built of thick timber and dark stone, strong and imposing, like the man who owned it. Barns and corrals dotted the property. Men were working, mending fences, tending to horses. They stopped and watched as Kane rode in, their faces curious but disciplined. No one called out a greeting. They just nodded respectfully as he passed, their eyes lingering on Lila for a moment before they returned to their work. Kane dismounted in front of the main house and tied his horse to the railing. He still didn't speak to her. He walked up the porch steps and opened the heavy wooden door, holding it open. It wasn't a gesture of courtesy. It was another silent command. Lila slid from her saddle, her legs weak. She followed him inside. The interior was dark and cool, a welcome relief from the sun. The furnishings were simple, masculine, and well-made. Everything was clean, orderly, and eerily quiet. It felt less like a home and more like a barracks. A woman appeared from a doorway down the hall. She was older, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. "Martha," Kane said. It was the first word he'd spoken since they left town. "Get a room ready and bring a tray." Martha's eyes flickered to Lila, taking in the bruised face and torn dress. Her expression was unreadable. She just nodded once and disappeared. Kane turned to Lila. He finally looked at her, his eyes a piercing gray. She braced herself. "The room is upstairs, second on the left," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Martha will bring you food and water. There's a bolt on the inside of the door." He paused, and for a moment, she thought he might say something more. Something to explain the bizarre events of the day. But he didn't. He just said, "Use it." Then he turned and walked down the hall into a room that looked like an office, closing the door behind him, leaving her alone in the silent, intimidating house. Lila stood there, utterly bewildered. He'd paid a fortune for her, brought her all this way, and now he was telling her to lock herself away from him. It made no sense. She slowly climbed the stairs, her hand trailing on the smooth, cool wood of the banister. She found the room, a small, sparse space with a narrow bed and a single window overlooking the vast, empty land. A few minutes later, Martha arrived with a tray. On it was a plate of roasted chicken, some bread, a pitcher of water, and a small bowl of clean water with a cloth. The housekeeper set the tray on a small table without a word. As she turned to leave, Lila found her voice. "Thank you," she whispered. Martha paused at the door. She looked back at Lila, a flicker of something, pity maybe, in her tired eyes. "He's not what you think," she said, her voice barely audible. Then she was gone, her footsteps receding down the hall. Lila stared at the closed door. "He's not what you think." What did that mean? She walked to the door and slid the heavy iron bolt into place. The sound echoed in the quiet room. She was safe for now, but she was a prisoner of a different kind, locked in a fortress of silence, owned by a man who was a complete and terrifying mystery. Days bled into one another at Black Creek. Lila saw almost nothing of Jedediah Kane. He was gone before the sun was fully up and returned long after it had set. She would sometimes catch a glimpse of him from her window, a distant figure on horseback, moving across his vast domain with that same relentless purpose. He never looked toward the house. She spent her time in a state of suspended animation. She ate the food Martha left for her. She cleaned her small room. She stared out the window, watching the rhythm of the ranch. The fear began to recede, replaced by a deep, gnawing confusion. This wasn't captivity as she'd known it with Croft. There were no threats, no demands. There was just nothing. A vast, empty silence. The bruises on her face started to fade, the colors softening from angry purple to a sickly yellow-green. With her physical healing came a sliver of her old strength. She couldn't just sit in this room forever. One morning she unbolted the door and went downstairs. She found Martha in the kitchen, kneading dough with a practiced, forceful rhythm. The older woman looked up, surprised to see her. "I can help," Lila said, her voice still rough from disuse. Martha studied her for a long moment, then gave a curt nod toward a pile of potatoes. "Peel." And so a new routine began. Lila helped Martha with the household chores. She scrubbed floors, mended clothes, tended the small vegetable garden out back. She worked hard, welcoming the physical exhaustion. It was better than the crippling anxiety of waiting for something to happen. Martha remained distant, speaking only to give instructions, but she never turned away Lila's help. A silent, grudging acceptance formed between them. Lila learned that Kane's house was a place of ghosts. There were no paintings on the walls, no personal trinkets, no signs of a life lived within its sturdy frame, except for one. The door to Kane's office was usually closed, but one afternoon she found it slightly ajar. Curiosity, a feeling she thought had been beaten out of her, got the better of her. She pushed the door open a fraction and peeked inside. The office was as Spartan as the rest of the house. A large desk, a few chairs, shelves overflowing with ledgers and books. But what caught her eye was a small silver frame on the corner of the desk, facing the chair where Kane would sit. In it was a photograph, faded and worn. It was a portrait of a young woman. Lila's breath caught in her throat. The woman was beautiful, with a gentle smile and kind eyes. But that wasn't what shocked her. The woman in the photograph looked almost exactly like her. The same shape of the face, the same dark hair, the same set of the jaw. It was like looking at a sister she never knew she had, or looking at herself, a version untouched by fear and pain. A cold dread washed over her. It was a horrifying, sickening realization. This was why he'd bought her. The impossible price, the silent treatment, the way he refused to even look at her. He hadn't seen her on that stage. He had seen a ghost. He had purchased a replacement for the woman in the picture. She felt sick. She backed away from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wasn't a person to him. She was an object, a stand-in for a memory. All this time she'd been wondering what he wanted from her. Now she thought she knew, and the truth was 1,000 times worse than any simple cruelty she could have imagined. She had to know more. The next day, while they were snapping beans on the back porch, Lila worked up the courage to ask Martha. "The photograph," she began, her voice low. "In his office. Who is she?" Martha's hands stilled. She didn't look up from the bowl in her lap. "That's not your place to ask." "She looks like me," Lila pressed, her voice trembling slightly. "That's a coincidence," Martha said flatly, but her knuckles were white as she gripped a handful of beans. Was she his wife?" Martha's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with a sudden fierce anger that startled Lila. "Leave it be, girl. You're safe here. You're fed. Don't go digging up bones. Some things are better left buried." The conversation was over, but Martha's harsh denial was more of a confirmation than anything else. There were bones here, all right, and Lila had the terrible feeling she was sleeping in a house built on top of a graveyard, driven by a new kind of fear, a fear of what she represented rather than what might be done to her. Lila began to explore. She kept to her chores, but her eyes were always open now, searching. She needed to understand the ghost she was meant to replace. Her search led her away from the house, up a small, windswept hill that overlooked the creek. It was a peaceful spot, the only place on the entire ranch that felt less like a fortress and more like a sanctuary. And there, under the shade of a lone, ancient cottonwood tree, was a single grave. It was marked by a simple carved wooden cross. Lila's heart pounded as she drew closer. She knelt in the tall grass, her fingers tracing the letters carved into the wood. The name was there, etched deep against the grain. Annalise Kane. Below the name were two dates: born 1860, died 1880, 5 years ago. She would have been 20 years old. So this was her. This was the woman in the photograph. Jedediah Kane's young dead wife. The uncanny resemblance, the sudden exorbitant price he paid, his cold and distant behavior. It all clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. He wasn't just grieving, he was haunted, and he had brought her here to live in that ghost's shadow. The thought was suffocating. Was she supposed to wear Annalise's clothes? To answer to her name? The safety she'd begun to feel on the ranch evaporated, replaced by a creeping horror. She wasn't a rescued woman, she was a doll, purchased to fill an empty space. Back in Dust Devil Springs, Silas Croft was not a man to let a public humiliation go unanswered. The $1,000 in gold was a balm to his greed, but not to his pride. Jedediah Kane had challenged him in front of the entire town, had taken something he considered his, and had done it without a word of explanation. The mystery of it all was fueling whispers, and Croft hated whispers he couldn't control. So he started his own. He began in the saloon, his voice low and concerned. "I worry about that poor girl," he'd say to anyone who would listen, shaking his head sadly. "Kane's a strange man, always has been, lives out there all alone. You remember what happened to his first wife, don't you?" He didn't need to say more. He just planted the seed. The memory of Annalise Kane's quiet, lonely death was fresh enough. People started to talk. They remembered Kane's grim silence after her passing. They remembered how he'd shut himself off from the world. A man like that, with that much land and that much solitude, who knew what darkness festered in him? "Paid $1,000 for her," Croft would add, letting the sum hang in the air. A man doesn't pay that kind of money unless he's got specific needs. And with her looking so much like poor Annalise, it's a bad business, a real bad business. The rumors spread like wildfire. Kane, the silent, powerful rancher, was recast as a grieving madman, a recluse who'd bought a look-alike to replace his dead wife, a brute who held her captive in his fortress of a ranch. The story was so compelling, so darkly romantic, that people wanted to believe it. It gave them an explanation for what they'd seen. The town sheriff, a man named Bartholomew Jones, was a man who valued a quiet life. And a quiet life in Dust Devil Springs meant staying on the right side of Silas Croft, who held the notes on half the businesses in town, including the sheriff's own gambling debts. Croft paid Jones a visit. He didn't make threats. He didn't have to. He just expressed his deep, civic-minded concern for Lila's welfare. "As a pillar of this community, Sheriff," Croft said, oozing false sincerity, "I feel it's my duty to make sure the girl is safe. Under the law, my contract with her was valid. Kane's purchase, while generous, is a civil matter. But her well-being, that's a criminal one. You ought to ride out there, just to check on her. Make sure she's not being held against her will." Sheriff Jones, a man with a weak spine and a healthy sense of self-preservation, agreed. It was the easiest path. A ride out to Black Creek, a few questions, and he could report back that all was well. It would satisfy Croft and keep the peace. He hadn't counted on Jedediah Kane. When Sheriff Jones rode up to the Black Creek ranch house a few days later, Kane was waiting for him on the porch. He wasn't holding a rifle in a threatening way, but the heavy shotgun was resting in the crook of his arm, a casual and potent statement. "Sheriff," Kane said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. "Kane," Jones replied, staying on his horse. He felt much safer with the extra height. "I'm here on official business. Got some concerns raised in town about the girl. Lila, just need to ask her a few questions, ensure her welfare." "Her welfare is my concern now," Kane said. "She's on my land." "That may be," Jones blustered, feeling his authority slip. "But I have a right to speak with her. Folks are saying you're holding her against her will." Kane's eyes narrowed slightly. "What folks?" The question was simple, but the implication was clear. Silas Croft. Jones shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "That ain't your business. Now, are you going to let me see her, or am I going to have to make this an official matter?" "She's a free woman," Kane said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. She'll see who she pleases, and I doubt very much that includes a man on Silas Croft's payroll. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. The sheriff's face reddened. He was about to retort, to make a threat about returning with a posse, when the front door creaked open. Leela stepped out onto the porch. She had heard the voices. She had stood by the door, her heart pounding, listening to the exchange. She looked from the weak, blustering sheriff to the unyielding man standing beside her. Kane hadn't called for her. He hadn't used her as a shield. He was prepared to handle this himself. He was protecting her. But in that moment, looking at the sheriff, a symbol of the corrupt, rotten town that had allowed her to be sold like cattle, Lila felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in months. Anger. She made a choice. She walked forward and stood next to Jedediah Kane. She wasn't hiding behind him. She was standing with him. She was no longer the bruised, terrified girl from the auction stage. Her face was still healing, but her eyes were clear and steady. "Sheriff," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. Jones looked at her, taken aback. "Ma'am, are you here of your own free will? Are you being held captive?" Lila held the sheriff's gaze. She could end it all right now. She could say yes, and he would take her away. Away from this silent, haunted man and his ghost wife. Away from this confusing, lonely life. Back to what? Back to Crofstown. Back to nothing? She looked at Kane. His face was unreadable stone, but he was standing between her and the world that had tried to destroy her. He hadn't laid a hand on her. He had given her a room, food, and a lock for her door. He had faced down the sheriff for her. He wasn't what she thought. Martha's words came back to her. "No, Sheriff," Lila said, her voice ringing with newfound conviction. "I am not being held captive. I am here by choice." Sheriff Jones stared, his mouth slightly agape. This was not the frightened, broken victim he'd been sent to rescue. This was a woman who knew her own mind. He had no authority here, no grounds to proceed. Beaten, he tipped his hat curtly. "Very well," he muttered, and without another word he turned his horse and rode away, kicking up a cloud of dust in his retreat. Lila and Kane stood on the porch, watching until he was a small dot on the horizon. The silence that fell between them was different this time. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of what had just happened. She had chosen a side. She had chosen his. That evening, for the first time, Jedediah Kane came to her. He didn't come to her room. He found her on the back porch watching the sunset, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and red. He didn't sit, but leaned against a post, his arms crossed. For a long time, he just watched the sunset with her. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, stripped of its earlier harshness. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," Lila replied, not looking at him. "I did." Another long silence stretched. She could feel him studying her. "Croft sent him," Kane stated. It wasn't a question. "I know." He finally moved, walking over to the porch railing to stand beside her. He looked out at his land, at the endless expanse of grass and hills turning purple in the twilight. "I imagine you have questions," he said. Lila's heart began to beat faster. This was it, the moment of truth. She thought of the photograph, of the grave on the hill. "Annalise," she said, the name a whisper on her lips. "Was she your wife?" Kane was silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice was thick with an old, deep pain. "No," he said softly. "She wasn't my wife." Lila turned to look at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "She was my sister," he said, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "My younger sister." The world tilted on its axis. His sister, not his wife? The entire theory she had built, the entire horrifying narrative of the grieving husband seeking a replacement, crumbled into dust. It made no sense. "What happened to her?" Lila asked, her voice barely audible. Kane took a deep, shuddering breath. He was about to open a door that had been sealed shut for 5 long years. "She died," he said. "But she didn't just die. Silas Croft killed her." Lila stared at him, speechless. The pieces of the puzzle were all there, but they were scattered and she couldn't see the picture. "Annalise was innocent," Kane began, his voice rough with memory. "She trusted people. Too much. When our parents passed, it was just the two of us. I built this ranch for her to give her a safe home. But she was lonely. She wanted a husband, a family of her own. He finally turned to look at Lila, his gray eyes shining with an unspeakable sorrow. She answered an advertisement in an Eastern paper, an ad for a respectable gentleman in Dust Devil Springs seeking a wife, a man of good standing and property. Croft, Lila breathed. Kane nodded grimly. She wrote to me, told me she was coming out to meet him. I told her to wait, to let me check the man out first, but she was young and impulsive and in love with the idea of it all. By the time I got her letter, she was already on her way. He paused, the pain of the memory etched on his face. When she got here, she found out the truth. Croft wasn't a respectable gentleman. He was a predator. The marriage contract was a trap, a way to indebt women, to own them. Annalise refused. She tried to leave. His voice cracked, just for a second. Croft wouldn't let her. He told her she owed him for her passage. He locked her up. She couldn't bear it. The shame, the imprisonment. She found a way out. The only way she could. Lila understood. The grave on the hill. It wasn't a death from sickness or accident. She took her own life, Kane said, the words falling like stones into the twilight. They called it a tragic fall. Croft paid the sheriff to rule it an accident. No one would listen to me. I was just the grieving brother, half mad with sorrow. A cold, terrible clarity washed over Lila. The auction, the bruises. Her own story was an echo of Annalise's. I left, Kane continued, his voice hardening into steel. I couldn't stay here, not then. But I swore I would come back. I swore I would find a way to make him pay for what he did. Not just for Annalise, for all of them. He walked back into the house without another word. Lila heard him in his office. A moment later he returned, carrying a heavy leather-bound ledger. He placed it on the railing between them and opened it. The pages were filled with names, written in Kane's neat, precise hand. There were dates, sums of money, locations. It was years of meticulous records. After Annalise died, he said, his finger tracing a line of script, I started digging. I followed the trail of Croft's money, his so-called businesses. He's been doing this for years, luring women out here with false promises, trapping them in debt, selling them one way or another. Lila looked down at the page. She saw Annalise's name, and below it, a dozen others. Names of women she'd never heard of. Women who had disappeared. Women who had been broken. I have been gathering proof for 5 years, Kane said, his voice a low, steady flame of pure resolve. This ledger documents his entire operation, his fraud, his trafficking, everything. But it's just numbers and names. To a court, it's just circumstantial. I needed more. I needed a witness. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw the truth of him. Not a madman, not a ghost-haunted recluse. A patient, relentless instrument of justice. I was in town that day to meet an informant, someone who was going to give me more evidence, he explained. Then I saw the auction. I saw you, and I saw him laughing. The memory of Croft's cruel laughter hung between them. I saw the same bruises my sister had, Kane went on, his voice tight. I saw the same fire in your eyes, the same refusal to be broken. I saw him doing it all over again, right out in the open. And I knew. He hadn't bought her because she looked like Annalise. The resemblance was just a tragic, painful coincidence. He had bought her because she was living Annalise's story. She was the proof he needed. I didn't know if you would trust me, he admitted. I didn't know how to explain. So I gave you a safe place, and I waited. I waited to see if you were strong enough. Today, when you stood up to that sheriff, I got my answer. He looked from the ledger to her face. The weight of his 5-year quest settled on her shoulders. This ledger, combined with your testimony, it's enough. It's enough to destroy him, to bring him to justice for every woman whose name is in this book. He was offering her a choice, a terrible, dangerous choice. I need you to testify, Lila, he said, his voice quiet but intense. I need you to go back to that town, stand up in front of everyone, and tell them what Silas Croft did to you. The air grew cold. Go back? Face the man who had beaten and humiliated her? Deliberately walk back into the viper's nest? Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to say no. She was safe here. Kane would protect her. She could disappear on this vast ranch and never see Dust Devil Springs again. She could hide, or she could fight. Lila looked at the ledger, at the list of forgotten names. Annalise Kane, Sarah Blackwood, Maria Flores. Each name was a ghost, a life ruined by one man's greed and cruelty. Her story was not unique. It was a pattern. And if she stayed silent, the pattern would continue. Another woman would be brought to that stage. Another contract would be signed. Another spirit would be broken. She thought of the grave on the hill, of a 20-year-old girl who saw no other way out. She had been given a second chance, a chance Annalise never had. What was she going to do with it? The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But now it was mixed with something else, a hot, burning rage, a desire for justice that was as strong as Kane's. She looked up from the book and met Jedediah Kane's gaze. He wasn't the silent, intimidating rancher anymore. He was a man who had turned his own unimaginable grief into a weapon for others. He wasn't asking her to do this for him, or even for his sister. He was asking her to do it for herself, and for all the names in the book. "When do we leave?" she asked. A flicker of something, respect, relief, passed through Kane's stoic eyes. "At dawn," he said. They rode into Dust Devil Springs the next morning, not as a rancher and his purchased property, but as allies, partners in a war that was about to become very public. They didn't ride fast. They came at a walk, side by side, their horses' hooves kicking up a slow, steady cloud of dust. Every person on the street stopped to stare. The whispers started instantly. Kane was back, and the girl was with him. Not hiding in the back of a wagon, but riding tall in the saddle, her head held high. The last remnants of her bruises were still visible, a faint yellowing on her cheekbone. But they no longer looked like a mark of shame. They looked like a battle scar. They didn't stop at the saloon or the general store. They rode straight to the one place in town that was supposed to represent the law, the sheriff's office. They dismounted and tied their horses to the rail. Kane carried the heavy ledger under one arm. He opened the door for Lila, and this time, it felt like a gesture of respect. Sheriff Jones was sitting at his desk, his boots propped up, looking through a stack of wanted posters. He looked up when they entered, and the color drained from his face. He quickly swung his feet to the floor. "Kane," he stammered. "Ma'am, what can I do for you?" "You can do your job," Kane said, his voice cold and flat. He dropped the ledger on the sheriff's desk. It landed with a loud thud that made Jones jump. "What's this?" the sheriff asked, eyeing the book suspiciously. "Evidence," Kane said. "Years of it, documenting Silas Croft's business of trafficking women." Jones stared at the book as if it were a rattlesnake. He licked his lips nervously. "Those are some mighty serious accusations, Kane. You can't just—" "I can," Kane interrupted, "and she is my witness." He nodded toward Lila. Lila stepped forward. She looked the sheriff dead in the eye, her voice clear and unwavering. "Silas Croft lured me here under false pretenses. He held me prisoner and beat me when I tried to leave. He was going to sell me into servitude. What he did to me, he has done to countless others." Sheriff Jones looked from Lila's determined face to Kane's iron expression, and then to the damning weight of the ledger on his desk. He could see the tide was turning. He could continue to protect Croft, a man who would throw him to the wolves without a second thought, or he could finally stand on the right side of the law. The fear of Jedediah Kane's quiet wrath was suddenly much more potent than his fear of Croft's debts. He slowly reached out and pulled the ledger toward him. He opened it to a random page and his eyes widened as he scanned the names and figures. This wasn't just an accusation. This was a meticulously detailed indictment. He closed the book and stood up. He looked pale, but his voice was firm. "I'll need a formal statement." He looked at Lila. "From you, ma'am." Then he looked at Kane. "And I'll need to secure this evidence." He walked over to a rack on the wall and took down a heavy set of keys. He picked up his hat. "You wait here," he said. "I'm going to go issue a warrant for the arrest of Silas Croft." The news of the warrant spread through town faster than a prairie fire. Croft heard it from one of his cronies, who came running into the saloon, breathless and terrified. For the first time in his life, Silas Croft felt the cold grip of real fear. He had always been untouchable, protected by his money and the town's fear of him. But he knew Kane. He knew that when Kane finally decided to move, he did not fail. Croft didn't wait. He scrambled, grabbing a bag and stuffing it with cash and gold from his safe. He ran out the back of the saloon, heading for the stables. He would grab his fastest horse and be across the county line before the sheriff even finished writing the warrant. He burst into the livery, shouting for his horse. The young stable hand, a boy named Eli, who saw everything and said little, fumbled with the stall door, his eyes wide with fear. Croft shoved him aside, saddled the horse himself with shaking hands, and led it out into the street. He swung himself into the saddle and dug his heels into the horse's flanks, charging out of town like a man possessed. He glanced back once, seeing the sheriff and a small crowd gathering in front of his saloon. He was going to make it. He was going to get away. He rounded the last building at the edge of town, the open road stretching out before him, and stopped dead. Standing in the middle of the road, blocking his path, was Jedediah Kane. He wasn't on horseback. He was just standing there, his feet planted, his arms loose at his sides. He looked as immovable as a mountain. "Get out of my way, Kane!" Croft shrieked, his voice cracking with panic. He reached for the pistol tucked into his waistband. Kane didn't move. He just watched him, his face impassive. Croft pulled the gun, his hand trembling. "I'll kill you. I swear I will." The horse, sensing the tension, skittered nervously. Croft tried to aim, but his nerve broke. He saw the cold certainty in Kane's eyes. He saw the end of his reign. There was no escape. There would be no gunfight. Kane had already won. With a sob of pure terror and defeat, Croft dropped the gun in the dust. His bravado, his cruelty, his entire empire of fear, it all crumbled to nothing in the middle of a dusty road, under the silent gaze of the man he had wronged 5 years before. The trial of Silas Croft was the biggest thing to ever happen in Dust Devil Springs. The small courthouse was packed every day. People came from all over the county to witness the downfall of the town's tyrant. The prosecutor, a young, ambitious lawyer from the territorial capital, used Kane's ledger to lay out the case, piece by damning piece. He detailed the web of deceit, the fraudulent contracts, the trail of broken lives and stolen money. The ledger was the map of Croft's evil, and the jury followed it, their faces growing grimmer with each revelation. But the heart of the trial was Lila. When she took the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. She looked directly at the jury, avoiding the sight of Croft sitting at the defendant's table, his face pale and shrunken. In a clear, steady voice, she told her story. All of it. The hopeful letters, the jarring arrival, the locked door, the contract, the beating, the terrifying auction. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She just laid out the facts, her quiet dignity more powerful than any outburst of anger or grief could ever be. When she finished, there was a moment of profound silence. Then, something incredible happened. An older woman at the back of the courtroom stood up. "He did it to my daughter too," she said, her voice shaking but loud. "She ran away 2 years ago. We never knew what happened." Then another woman stood, a shopkeeper's wife. "He held my husband's debt. He made suggestions." One by one, others found their voice. People who had been too afraid to speak for years, emboldened by Lila's courage, began to tell their own stories of Croft's cruelty and corruption. It was an avalanche of truth, bearing Croft under the weight of his own sins. Jedediah Kane sat at the back of the courtroom through it all, watching. He never testified. He didn't need to. His work was done. He had forged the weapon, and Lila had wielded it. Justice was no longer his private quest. It belonged to the whole town now. The jury took less than an hour. The verdict was guilty, on all counts. As the judge sentenced Silas Croft to a lifetime of hard labor, a collective sigh of relief went through the courtroom. A dark cloud that had hung over Dust Devil Springs for years had finally lifted. After the verdict, Kane and Lila walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun. The air felt cleaner, lighter. They rode back to Black Creek in a comfortable silence. It was a different kind of quiet now, one of peace and shared victory. When they arrived back at the imposing stone house, it no longer looked like a fortress to Lila. It looked like a sanctuary. Kane dismounted and walked with her to the porch. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out two things. One was a ticket for the stagecoach, heading east, leaving the next morning. The other was a thick leather purse, heavy with coin. He held them out to her. "I promise to pay your way," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "This will get you home, wherever that is. It's more than enough for you to start a new life. You're free, Lila. You don't owe me, or this place, anything." Lila looked at the ticket in his hand. It represented a life she once desperately wanted back. A life away from the dust and the pain and the cruelty of the frontier. She could take it. She could go back to the east, find some quiet town, and try to forget everything that had happened here. She looked at the purse. It was the price of her freedom, earned and paid for. Then she looked up at Jedediah Kane. She saw the quiet, lonely man who had channeled his grief into a crusade for justice. She saw the vast, empty ranch around them, a place built as a safe haven that had lost its purpose. She saw the grave on the hill, a memorial to a past that could never be changed, and she saw a future that was unwritten. She had come here seeking a home and found a monster. Then a quiet man had bought her, and she thought him a different kind of monster, but she had been wrong on both counts. She had found a home after all, not the one she'd expected, but one she had helped to build. A home forged in silence and strength, in shared purpose and hard-won justice. Slowly, she reached out and pushed his hand back, gently closing his fingers over the ticket in the purse. "I think," she said, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time in a long time, "that I'm already home." Kane stared at her, his gray eyes searching hers. For the first time, the stone mask of his face seemed to soften, and a flicker of something new, not grief, not vengeance, but hope, shone in their depths. He didn't say a word. He just gave her a slow, single nod. They stood there for a moment on the porch of the quiet ranch house, two survivors who had found in each other not a replacement for what they had lost, but a reason to build something new, together. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe.